Hi, everybody. This is my lecture on the Olympian family. So this is the group of 12, sometimes 14 gods that we call the Olympian pantheon. Okay, so let's go through this quickly together. Here's a nice simplified map of the family tree that explains where everybody comes from. I like this because it's simplified. It doesn't have all the things mentioned by Hesiod and the theogony, right? And you'll notice this map has a different version of Aphrodite. Hesiod has Aphrodite being formed from the removed genitals of Uranus, but in this version it's the other. And of course, one thing to remember is that there are multiple versions of these things, but this has Aphrodite as the daughter of Diana and Zeus. But I like this. It's a little more simplified and easier to navigate just to get an idea. Right, so there's the family tree. Something I'm going to just talk about quickly because you have some textbook pages to read with much more complex, in-depth look at these gods in specific detail. So I'm just going to talk about some big ideas. Again, we've talked about some of these before, but the anthropomorphism, the anthropocentrism, the lack of a single authoritative version of these myths. And one thing I want to talk about, which is what I call the Disneyfication of mythology. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So 4 things to consider. So, one thing, the anthropomorphism. Remember, that's just giving inhuman things human characteristics. So giving gods human characteristics. We do this in the Christian religion. People do this in the Christian religion or Judeo-Christian religion, where we talk about God as the Father and this and that. I mean, God isn't literally a father in that human sense, but we give that human characteristic to help us understand how that relationship between that Christian God and humans, right? So we get this in the Greek religion and mythology in a much greater extent, right? So, for example, the gods are a family, right? They're related to each other. They're brothers, or sisters, or lovers, or uncles, or whatever, cousins, right? And these gods, including Zeus, the figure of all justice and knowing, he's not exactly omniscient, right? And when we get into the Iliad, we're going to see representations of him very much tied to forces outside of his control, right? So they're far from omniscient, far from omnipotent, and the gods often embody contradictions. That's one of the fun things about reading Greek myths, is that they're, one minute they're nice, one minute they're mean. Here's a funny meme, just maybe thinking about one of Zeus's main flaws is his wandering eye, and his lusts, I guess you could say. Very human though, right? I mean, this isn't how you think of a god, as a philandering bad person, but he is definitely that in some myths. So moving on to the anthropocentrism, and anthropocentrism just means the centering of humans, right? And so again, right, Greek myth is all about this. Is very much centered on the human figure and the human relationship to God, to gods, right? The gods are very much embodiments of human elements of the human psyche and the human situation, right? And in fact, one of the original Olympian gods is Hestia, right? She's the god of the hearth. She's one of the original 6 Olympian gods, but she kind of gets pushed out by Dionysus when Dionysus comes along a bit later. Hestia is pushed out of that original 12. That's why sometimes we talk about 12 plus 2. Hestia is one of the original 12, but she kind of gets pushed out by this half-human figure, Dionysus, right? He's very much this kind of intermediary figure between humanity and the gods in a lot of ways. One thing we're going to be reading this week is the Homeric hymn, and the Homeric hymns are dedicated to single tales of the gods. They're hymns about a single god, one of these main gods usually, right? But sometimes they're to other gods too. Most of them are to the Olympian gods, the most important ones. These Homeric hymns, they're called Homeric hymns, but they weren't actually written by Homer. They're written in the Homeric style, right? They're singing the praises of the gods in that similar poetic style, so they're called Homeric hymns, even though it's been, I don't think there's any scholar of any any note who actually thinks that Homer wrote them. Originally, they were attributed to Homer, and people in the ancient world would do that to make their hymns seem more reliable or more pleasing. They would say, "Oh, this is from Homer," right? So they got attributed to Homer, but he didn't actually write any of these hymns. And these are just kind of smaller efforts singing the praise of individual gods. Just noted about Homer here, right? Here's a list of the 33 Homeric hymns, right? And I've in my notes, if you go through my PowerPoint, you can actually click on these, and it'll take you to the site where you can read these if you wish. We're going to read one of them together, just a shorter one to Dionysus, just to get a taste for this. But I would strongly recommend reading them. The one to I can't remember which one it is, but Demeter is a great. It's a bit longer. It's that great story about her daughter Persephone going down and being not going down, being captured by Hades, and getting trapped there and eating the pomegranate, and that whole story. So that's a good one to read. There's some really fun ones in here. But we're just going to get a flavor with one, so feel free to read more if you wish. Some of them are just fragments, and some of them are very long. And just to give you a little flavor, here's one from the hymn to Helios, who was the original sun god before Apollo kind of took his role, as Greek myth made Apollo a bigger figure. So here's from the beginning. Hail to you, Lord, freely bestow on me substance that cheers the heart. And now that I have begun with you, I will celebrate the race of mortal men, half divine, whose deeds the muses have showed to mankind. So you can see it's a very grandiose, singing the praises kind of language, right? These Homeric hymns would have been recited before like a longer piece, maybe like part of the Iliad or something at some kind of festival, or before Hesiod would perform, they would do some hymns, right? So this is kind of like, the warm-up act would be some of these hymns, just to set the stage and that kind of thing, and maybe honor the specific god to whom the festival was dedicated, if that was relevant. Okay, also, there's no single authoritative version of these myths, right? If I go back a couple slides, you can see there are multiple hymns to Demeter, multiple hymns to Apollo, right? So I've talked about this before in my lectures, the Greeks didn't have like a Bible or something with the official version. So there were different versions of these myths. Some of them were localized. Remember, there was no internet. There was no communication beyond what you said to somebody. Books didn't exist as we know them, but written language on parchment, on tablets would have been much rarer, and literacy was very low, right? So communication was oral, and it was face-to-face. So you can see how that would lead to many different versions of these myths, right? If this little village over here is telling one version, this little village over here is telling another one, you'd get very different versions very quickly. Also, these myths are syncretic, right? The syncretism I've been talking about, which means the merging of different mythical and religious systems. So again, imagine, you have this small village in the north of Greece and this other small village in the south of Greece, and they've had different traditions. So this village in the north of Greece combines their already pre-existing gods and goddesses and mythical figures with these other Greek stories, and the village in the south of Greece does the same thing, but they have a different tradition. So then you get different versions of the same story, right? That are combining different other cultural traditions. This is what we mean by syncretism. That's one part of what we're talking about. Okay. And with the bigger works that we're reading, Hesiod and Homer, you're going to see that there's different things the authors are trying to say. In Hesiod, he's very much trying to make Zeus out to be this figure of divine justice, and it's all about Zeus. Whereas in Homer, you're going to see a very different thing. I won't spoil it, but he's not. His tales of the Iliad, of the fall of Troy, and the voyage of Odysseus are not centered as much around Zeus as Hesiod. So you can see how they use myth to do different things. Okay. Finally, I want to talk about the Disneyfication of myths. Many details have been sanitized, right, cleaned up over the years. There's a term we use for this, bowdlerizing a text. We say this is after a real life person, a guy named Thomas Bowdler, who in the 19th century, he published what he called the Family Shakespeare, which was a collection of Shakespeare's plays with all the naughty bits taken out. And there's lots of naughty bits in Shakespeare if you haven't read it. recently, any of his plays, what's that play? Measure for Measure opens up with two guards outside the palace joking about hemorrhoids, right? So you get all kinds of stuff like that, and then King Lear has all these jokes about uh, children born outside of wedlock, right? So all kinds of stuff in Shakespeare. It's a little bit naughty and fun to read, and so this guy decided that decent Christian families needed a Shakespeare free of the naughty bits, and so he published one in 1807. So that's where this term comes from, bowdlerizing a text. It means cleaning up and sanitizing, getting rid of the usually fun and dirty bits. So for us, if you've watched a Disney movie, you know that it's been cleaned up a lot. Heracles is a super smiley, shiny hero who didn't murder his whole family, right? Which he did in the original Greek myth. And you get lots of other stuff too. Most of the gods are really cleaned up. Here's a couple statues from ancient Greece. These are phallic symbols, obviously, right? And this is meant to be a statue of Hermes. Hermes was, the god of the traveler. So you'd find his statue along, roadways and such, and it would be there was always this phallic symbol. So this is very much part of representation of these gods, is this very sexualized part. Remember, a lot of god worship, especially older god worship, is tied to fertility and the rhythms of life. So this is not to be unexpected, but you don't see this in a Disney movie, do you? I don't think I've ever seen one with that. Also, the pederasty that was part of Greek culture, which is, generally older or middle-aged men with like younger men, not children exactly, but what we would call teenagers, right? Obviously these categories didn't really exist in the same way in Greek culture. Pedophilia was not. We're not talking about pedophilia. We're talking about a slightly different thing. We're talking about what we would consider too young people who are too young, boys who are too young, with older men, right? And they would be, brought into sexual maturity. In that way, you can find tons of art and references to these kinds of relationships. There's Zeus and his cupbearer. There's numerous lovers of Apollo and Dionysus, and tons of other figures. So this is another part of Greek culture that doesn't make it into Disney movies that often, but was definitely a part of these figures. Anyways, that's about it for this lecture. I just want to talk about some bigger concepts as you're getting into those sections from the textbooks. For the textbook, which is getting into the details about the gods, just to give you some context. Okay, thank you.